This year, over 200 serving foreign ministers, former prime ministers, members of national parliaments and European Parliament, EU commissioners, former NATO secretary-generals, professors, journalists and business leaders came together at ECFR's annual council meeting in The Hague. After ECFR's director Mark Leonard and the Dutch Foreign Minister Koenders opened the conference, the discussions focused on the result of Britain's EU referendum. As the vote took place just days earlier, one of the main topics of the conference was the implications that Britain's exit would have for the European Union.
I'm not a British psychoanalyst, and so I cannot get to the absolute basis as to why Brits took this decision. But the bottom line is you have a huge debate going on across the international community, which is a debate between nationalism and internationalism, between globalization and localization, between those who have won out of the globalization stakes and those who have lost or believe that they have lost through the globalization stakes. And you have a global debate between big cities and everyone who lives outside big cities. And this is a debate which is alive in Britain, it's alive in the rest of Europe, it's alive in North America, hence the Trump factor. It's alive also in countries like Australia. And I think, therefore, the challenge of politics is to have that as an accurate diagnosis. And then secondly, deal with the fact that if you're going to sustain a globalization project, if you're going to sustain a European project, that your ability to wrap in people who feel excluded from the project is critical.
In the following discussion, former NATO Secretary-General Jaap de Hoop Scheffer and others analysed how NATO and the EU could respond to Russian aggression. At the dinner in the Peace Palace, ECFR co-chair and former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt, gave an opening speech reflecting on how Europe has shaped the West. The second day of the conference included breakout sessions, which focused on the EU's relations with Syria, Libya, Russia, China and Turkey.
Well, we had a very interesting and somewhat even a heated debate whether EU and Turkey can prevent a blow-up, and I firmly believe yes, and I hope we will find an accommodation, because Turkey, I think, is our strategic partner. And I think the migration deal is just the latest in the examples of how important an alignment is. We are working on full implementation of that. Turkey will have to decide with its anti-terrorism legislation whether it is willing to respect the red lines that the Union has around fundamental freedoms, assembly, expression, etc. But so far they have been delivering on the stemming the migration flows. We are now seeking a mandate for expansion of the customs union, and perhaps we have the best chance ever for a breakthrough in Cyprus, which would then bring a new element into the discussion. But of course, there was a big sentiment in the room about Turkey not being quite decided whether it wants to go along the European values, and there was also a very strong sentiment among commentators about the enlargement process being sort of a pretend game in a sense. And one of the conclusions, or one of the sentiments there, was perhaps now with Brexit there is an opportunity to think of a new type of a strategic engagement that could include others, such as Ukraine and Turkey and Britain, and so that was one of the ideas that came out.
Participants exchanged ideas on how to deal with migration and national identity, topics that are likely to stay on many EU countries' agendas, at least until next year's annual council meeting.
I often hear in Europe this loose reference to the Australian, quote, model, unquote. The bottom line is this: Australia is a country of immigration. When I saw that Britain had net migration figures of 366,000 in the year 2015, well, they're probably about 200,000 a year in Australia. And we're a country of 1/3 the population of the United Kingdom. To which often the response is, but Britain's a little island and Australia's a big continent. Well, if you actually chopped out the desert bits in Australia, it's not all that big. So the bottom line here is, one, Australia has a long history since the Second World War of having a progressively open migration policy. We do it based on skills, and we do it based on also on family reunion, and we have always had a significant designated quota for refugees, somewhere between 10 and 20,000 a year from whichever hellhole in the world the UNHCR selects people. Therefore, I think it's very important to bear in mind that our circumstances are fashioned by our own experience. And as a country of long-standing immigration, which for us is familiar, I mean, 1/3 of the country, I think, is born outside the country, is a much more familiar and relaxed sort of view of orderly migration. Where Australians have a similar concept of the question of asylum seekers and refugees is when there is any fundamental challenge to the orderly migration system, and how is that best managed by the refugee authorities around the world. And on the question of the future operation of the UNHCR, which is the global body empowered under international law to deal with large movements of people as asylum seekers and prospectively as refugees, the UNHCR has dropped the ball. The head of the UNHCR, Antonio Guterres, said in December last year, at the conclusion of his period in office, that the system was broken. The UNHCR system needs to be reformed in terms of its policies on countries of origin, neighbouring countries, transit countries, burden sharing amongst destination countries. That is the way in which future global policies on migration and asylum seekers and refugees should be based, not on some particular locality response. It should be global principles, global institutions handling it, properly resourced in order to do the job. And remember, it was the under-resourcing of the UNHCR's functions in Jordan and in Lebanon and in Turkey in the middle of last year, which led to this triggering of 1 million plus people seeking to remove themselves to Europe. So my answer to the question of what's the best approach for the future of asylum seekers, refugees policy, in Europe, it is to participate in the root and branch reform of the UNHCR system.